Tara Okoye had always been the quiet observer, the student who asked the tough questions but never quite made waves. But when she saw her classmate, Jamal, dragged to the ground by Officer Greg Mallory in broad daylight, something inside her snapped. Without thinking, she pulled out her phone and began recording, capturing the violence that unfolded in the street. Tara never imagined that one simple act doing what she believed was right would change the trajectory of her life forever. Tara had no idea that her recording, which many would consider an act of courage, would become the very thing used to break her. Instead of being praised for standing up, she was arrested. Her crime? Interfering with police business. The irony? She was doing nothing but bearing witness to the kind of injustice that had always loomed in her small city, a place where bias ran deeper than anyone cared to admit. It happened so fast. 1 minute, Tara was recording, her hands trembling slightly as she focused the camera on the officer's brutal treatment of Jamal. The next, she was surrounded by officers. She barely had time to process what was happening before Officer Mallory's cold eyes locked with hers. And before she knew it, she was in handcuffs. "That's obstructing justice," Officer Mallory spat as he shoved her into the back of the squad car, her phone still clutched tightly in her hand. Tara's mind raced as she struggled to comprehend the sudden shift in her world. She had expected to be applauded for her bravery, not thrown into the back of a police car as if she were the criminal. By the time they arrived at the station, her phone was gone, and a new charge had been slapped onto her record: interfering with police business. Tara sat in the holding cell, her head spinning. The walls around her felt like they were closing in, but there was no time to dwell on it. Her family, working hard to make ends meet, couldn't afford an attorney, and the public defenders were already overwhelmed with cases. She was on her own. The days that followed only deepened the unfairness. At her first hearing, Judge Evelyn Mensah barely glanced at her as Tara stood before her, a girl who had been mistaken for someone incapable of defending herself. "Tara Okoye," the judge said flatly, her voice betraying no emotion. "It's clear you've made some poor choices. You'll be assigned a public defender. We'll move forward with the case." But Tara wasn't about to let someone else fight her battle. She had spent years studying civics, absorbing everything she could about the law. She wasn't some passive teenager to be walked over by the system. With steely determination, she informed the court, "Your Honor, I'd like to represent myself." The room erupted into murmurs. No one thought she could do it. A high school senior barely 18 years old was going to defend herself in a case against a seasoned officer, with a prosecutor who would do anything to bury her under the weight of the system. "You want to represent yourself?" The prosecutor, a man with a polished suit and a smug smile, sneered. "This is a felony charge, Miss Okoye. You're playing with fire." Tara held his gaze. "I'll take my chances," she said, her voice steady. But it wasn't going to be easy. Every step she took in preparing her case was met with obstacles. Her classmates, who had witnessed the arrest, were too scared to testify. Jamal, the boy she had tried to protect, was too afraid to speak out, having already been told that staying quiet was safer. And to make matters worse, the video footage she had recorded mysteriously vanished. No one seemed to know where it went. It was as though the truth was being erased before her very eyes. As the trial began, Tara felt the weight of the courtroom press down on her. The prosecutor was ruthless, twisting every word she spoke, making her sound like a rebellious teenager trying to undermine the police. Officer Mallory sat in the witness stand, playing the role of the innocent, misunderstood officer who had been just doing his job. But Tara wasn't backing down. With every cross-examination, she chipped away at the officer's story, exposing holes in his testimony that no one else seemed willing to see. Her questions, though pointed and sharp, were met with disbelief, and at times even mockery. "You're really going to argue that an officer of the law is lying?" the prosecutor sneered. Tara didn't flinch. "I'm not saying he's lying. I'm saying his version of events is wrong." The judge, though fair, looked at her with skepticism. She wasn't sure what to make of a young girl standing up against a man who had been a part of the system for over 20 years. Her words were encouraging, but there was doubt in her eyes, doubt that Tara could truly see this through. It was the final day of the trial. Tara had been forced to cross-examine Officer Mallory. He had already torn her apart with his lies and manipulations, but Tara knew the truth. She had one last chance to prove that her actions capturing the arrest on video were not interference but a necessary act of defiance in the face of injustice. Officer Mallory, Tara began, her voice steady, but her heart hammering. You claim that I was obstructing justice by filming your actions. But isn't it true that you didn't even tell Jamal why he was being arrested? Mallory faltered. He looked at the judge nervously. Tara pressed on. You didn't tell him his rights. You didn't even give him a chance to comply. And now you're blaming me for recording it. Tara's voice rose, the audience shifting in their seats as the weight of her words sank in. The officer's arrogance began to crack. His posture, once so confident, became rigid and defensive. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. I wasn't obstructing anything, Tara continued, her voice cutting through the tension. I was documenting what needed to be documented. Because silence in the face of injustice is complicity. The room was silent. Even the judge seemed momentarily stunned by Tara's boldness. Officer Mallory sat there, his face reddening with anger, but his defenses slowly crumbling under the weight of her words. Your Honor, Tara said, standing tall. I rest my case. The judge didn't immediately speak. She simply looked down at the papers in front of her, her expression unreadable. Tara's heart raced as the room waited for the verdict. The prosecutor's smug smile had faded, but no one knew what would happen next. Tara had fought for the truth, but would the system listen? Would the courtroom stand with her? Or would it silence her once again? And then, in that heavy silence, the judge spoke. I'll take a short recess before rendering my decision, she said, her tone flat. The tension was unbearable. Tara's fate was now in the hands of the very system she had challenged. The very system that had already marked her as guilty before she even stepped foot in that courtroom. And as she stood there, waiting for the decision, she realized that this was just the beginning. The courtroom held its breath. Tara stood, her legs trembling, her heart pounding as she stared at Judge Evelyn Mensah. The moment seemed to stretch into infinity as the silence between them grew deafening. Tara's case had hung in the balance for days, her future uncertain, the truth clawing its way to the surface. Could a single act of courage, a teenager recording police misconduct, be enough to undo years of systemic bias? The judge finally lifted her head, her eyes meeting Tara's with an unreadable expression. I will render my decision shortly, Judge Mensah said, her voice cool and deliberate. This is a serious matter. Tara swallowed hard, trying to steady herself. The judge's words didn't reassure her. They only deepened her unease. What would come next? The decision she had been waiting for felt like a ticking time bomb, each second stretching into an eternity. As the courtroom recessed, Tara's mind raced. What would she do if they found her guilty? What if the entire system, her city, the court, the authorities refused to acknowledge the truth? The days after the trial's recess were filled with uncertainty. Tara tried to stay focused, but every minute felt like a countdown to the worst possible outcome. She spent sleepless nights reviewing her case, trying to find any final angles, any last piece of evidence that would tip the scales in her favor. But what if it wasn't enough? What if the very system she was up against was too entrenched in its own biases to care? Her mother, Mrs. Okoye, noticed the wear on her daughter's face, the exhaustion behind her eyes. Tara, you've done everything you could, she said, her voice softer than usual. Whatever happens, I'm proud of you. But Tara couldn't accept that. Not yet. Not while she knew the fight wasn't over. Tara had to believe that justice still had a chance. She had to believe that, despite everything stacked against her, she could make the system listen. Then, just days before the final verdict, Tara received a visit from an unexpected ally. Mr. Benson, her civics teacher, knocked on her door one evening, carrying a heavy envelope. Tara was surprised to see him. She hadn't expected anyone to help her now, not when she was so close to the finish line. Come in, Tara said, stepping aside as Mr. Benson entered the room. He handed her the envelope, his face tense with urgency. "Tara, I've been doing some digging. You're not going to like what I've found." Tara opened the envelope, scanning the contents with a growing sense of dread. It was a report, an official document showing multiple instances of police misconduct, including the very incident she had recorded. But there was something else, something darker. The report revealed a pattern of cover-ups and a network of high-ranking officials who had manipulated evidence and blocked investigations into police brutality in their district for years. "Someone's been keeping a record," Mr. Benson said quietly. "I think you've stumbled onto something much bigger than you realize." Tara's hands trembled as she read the names of officers and city officials linked to the cover-ups. She didn't know who to trust. How could she take on this entire system on her own? Her heart sank. If she exposed the truth, she would be facing not just Officer Mallory but an entire network of people who would stop at nothing to protect their power. "Who else knows about this?" Tara asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Just you and me," Mr. Benson replied. "I've been gathering evidence secretly, hoping you'd win the case. But now, well, I think we're dealing with more than just one bad cop." The next few days were a whirlwind. Tara knew she had to be careful. If anyone found out she had this information, it could be dangerous. So, she kept the documents hidden, sharing them only with trusted individuals. Meanwhile, the prosecution was pulling every dirty trick in the book. Their narrative was clear. Tara was an angry teenager trying to make a name for herself by attacking an officer who was simply doing his job. They painted her as reckless, claiming that her video was distorted, edited, and taken out of context. The pressure was mounting, and even her own peers were beginning to doubt her. "You're wasting your time," one of her classmates told her one afternoon. "You can't win against the system." But Tara refused to back down. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore, she was fighting for Jamal, for every person who had ever been silenced by the system, for every single person who had suffered under the weight of prejudice. She spent countless hours preparing her final defense. She went over her notes again and again, making sure she understood every legal nuance, every loophole the prosecution might try to use. But it wasn't just about the law. It was about something bigger, something more emotional. Tara wasn't just challenging an officer. She was challenging a culture that allowed those in power to walk all over the powerless. She had to expose that. When the trial finally resumed, the atmosphere was electric. Tara stood before the judge, the prosecutor, and the officers, knowing that the fate of not just her own future but the future of her community rested on this moment. Officer Mallory sat in the witness stand once again, this time more composed, but Tara could see the fear behind his eyes. He knew she was getting close to the truth, and yet his arrogance remained. Tara took a deep breath, then stepped forward. She addressed the court, her voice calm but strong. "Your Honor," she began, "I've spent a lot of time in this courtroom, watching as the system has failed me and my community. I've been called an obstruction. But the only thing I've obstructed is the silence that allows these injustices to continue." She could feel the eyes of the room on her. The judge, the prosecutor, Officer Mallory, even the audience, packed with people who had come to watch the trial. Tara knew that every word she spoke mattered now. "The truth is simple," Tara continued. "The police were in the wrong. Officer Mallory was in the wrong. And if I hadn't been there, if I hadn't recorded it, none of you would even know about it. We can't keep pretending that this isn't happening. Not when the evidence is right in front of us." The prosecutor tried to interrupt, but Tara pressed on, her words growing stronger. "You can try to make me the villain. You can try to manipulate the truth. But the truth won't be hidden anymore. It's time for it to come to light." The judge seemed unmoved, but there was something about Tara's words, something about the way she carried herself, that caused the courtroom to shift. Even the prosecutor's confident posture wavered. But then, as the tension reached its peak, something unexpected happened. One of the witnesses, a fellow student named Jason, stood up. He had been hesitant to testify for fear of retaliation, but now he couldn't stay silent any longer. His voice shook as he spoke. "I was there. I saw it. Officer Mallory didn't just arrest Jamal. He attacked him. And when Tara started recording, She was the only one brave enough to speak out. She wasn't in the wrong. The room went silent. Jason's testimony was a turning point, but it wasn't the end. Tara still had to face her biggest challenge, the system itself. And just as the weight of her case seemed to tip in her favor, a new obstacle appeared. The city council had begun working behind the scenes to discredit her. As Tara walked out of the courtroom that day, she was met by someone she never expected. A well-dressed man with a confident smile. "Miss Okoye, we need to talk," he said. His voice was smooth, almost too smooth. "I'm here to offer you a deal. Walk away from this and we'll make sure your future is secure. But keep pushing this case and, well, things could get complicated." Tara's heart raced. Who was this man? What were they trying to offer her? And why did it feel like everything was about to spiral out of her control? She stood frozen, trying to process the implications of his words. Was this her chance to get out, to walk away from the fight that had consumed her? Or was this the moment where she had to take her final stand? Tara stood frozen, her mind racing as the well-dressed man in front of her spoke. His voice smooth and calculated. The words he spoke were enough to send a chill down her spine. "Miss Okoye," he began, his tone deceptively friendly. "I'm here to offer you a deal. Walk away from this and we'll make sure your future is secure. A scholarship, a job. We can ensure that everything you've worked for, everything you've dreamed of, comes true." Tara's heart thudded in her chest. Everything she had fought for, everything she had endured up until this point was suddenly up for negotiation. Her mind flashed to her mother, to Jamal, to the countless people who had been wronged by the system she was now challenging. And yet, the temptation to just walk away was so strong. A future without the looming threat of defeat, without the constant weight of uncertainty, was something she had never considered before. But then, she remembered the faces of those she'd seen suffer, the young men and women who were swallowed by a system that never cared for their pain. And she remembered her own fight, the struggle she had begun with nothing but her voice, her determination, and the truth on her side. "No," Tara said firmly, her voice cutting through the tension in the air. "I didn't come this far to back down now." The man smiled, but it wasn't a reassuring smile. "Very well," he said, his tone darkening slightly. "But know this, Miss Okoye, your battle is far from over. The system doesn't just let go. It fights back, and it fights dirty." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Tara standing alone in the courthouse corridor, the weight of his words sinking into her bones. She was more determined than ever, but now she knew that she was facing an even greater force than she had anticipated. This wasn't just about her and Officer Mallory, it was about a deeply ingrained system of power, influence, and control. A system that would stop at nothing to maintain its grip. The next few days were a blur of strategizing, sleepless nights, and gut-wrenching decisions. Tara could feel the pressure mounting with every passing hour. The media had already started to latch onto her case, some applauding her courage, others labeling her a troublemaker. Her name had become a symbol, but not the one she had imagined. Tara knew that if she was going to expose the truth, she couldn't do it alone. She needed allies, people who understood what she was up against. People who had seen the system work in its most insidious ways. The first person she reached out to was Jamal. She hadn't spoken to him since the trial, and his silence weighed on her. She knew he was scared, but Tara also knew that if he could find the courage to speak out, his testimony would be a crucial piece in her fight. "I can't do this, Tara," Jamal admitted over the phone, his voice barely a whisper. "They've already made it clear what'll happen if I speak out." Tara clenched her fists, frustration boiling inside her. "Jamal, if you don't speak out, we'll never change anything. You know that, right? We're not just doing this for us, we're doing this for everyone who's been silenced." There was a long pause before Jamal spoke again. "I don't want to be a part of this fight. I don't want to lose everything." Tara's voice softened, her words firm but compassionate. "You're already part of this fight. We all are, whether we want to be or not. And you don't have to face this alone. You never have to." Jamal was silent for a moment, the weight of her words clearly sinking in. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely audible. "I'll testify." Tara felt a rush of relief. One step forward. But she knew it wouldn't be enough. They needed more. Tara spent the next few days scouring through records, speaking with local activists, and gathering whatever evidence she could. What she uncovered was chilling. The corruption wasn't just isolated to Officer Mallory. It ran deep, stretching through the police department, the city council, and even the local media. It was as though the system had been built to protect its own, to bury the truth beneath layers of lies and misinformation. But Tara didn't flinch. She wasn't going to let them win. She knew the stakes had gotten higher, but she also knew that she had to expose every crack in the system, every hidden truth. She turned to her civics teacher, Mr. Benson, who had quietly supported her throughout the trial. He had been gathering his own information and had a network of people who were willing to help. Together, they began to build a case that would expose the corruption that lay beneath the surface of her city's law enforcement. "We need to show them the bigger picture," Mr. Benson said one evening as they pored over documents. "This isn't just about you or Jamal. It's about systemic oppression." Tara nodded. "I know. I've been so focused on the trial, I almost forgot that this is bigger than one officer. It's about everything they've done to keep people like us in our place." But even as Tara and Mr. Benson dug deeper, the resistance grew stronger. The authorities were closing in. The local media began to question Tara's credibility, spinning the story to make her appear reckless and out of control. They painted her as a radical, someone who was seeking attention rather than justice. The more Tara uncovered, the more she realized how powerful and far-reaching the corruption was. It was a tangled web of biased policing, manipulated narratives, and unchallenged authority. The people who had the power to bring about change were the very ones keeping the system intact, feeding the narrative that people like Tara, people like Jamal, were troublemakers who needed to be silenced. It was a war of narratives, a fight to control the truth. But Tara wasn't backing down. The day of the trial arrived, and the courtroom was buzzing with anticipation. The media had shown up in full force, the tension thick in the air. Tara stood at the front of the room, her mind racing as she prepared for the most important day of her life. Officer Mallory sat on the witness stand, his demeanor as cold and confident as ever. But Tara could see the cracks in his facade. He knew the walls were closing in. His story was unraveling. Tara took a deep breath and stood up. "It was time." "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady and confident. "This case is not just about one officer's actions. It's about a system that has allowed this behavior to persist for years. It's about how the truth has been buried, how the narrative has been twisted to protect those in power. And it's about how we, the people, have been silenced for far too long." She turned to the jury, her eyes burning with determination. "I stand before you today not just as a teenager fighting for justice, but as a representative of every single person who has ever been ignored, dismissed, or oppressed. And I ask you, I beg you to look beyond the badges and the titles, and see the truth for what it is." As Tara continued, the tension in the room was palpable. For the first time, the power of her words began to shift the atmosphere. Officer Mallory's confidence wavered. The prosecutor, too, seemed less sure of himself. And then, as Tara presented the final piece of evidence, documents showing the chain of cover-ups, the systematic oppression that had gone unchecked for years, there was a shift. A moment where the weight of the truth settled over the room like a fog, suffocating the lies that had held it captive for so long. The judge looked down at the documents, her face unreadable. The jury shifted in their seats. Tara's heart pounded in her chest, but she couldn't afford to stop now. A tense silence filled the room as the judge stood to announce the verdict. Tara's heart raced, her hands trembling slightly, but she kept her eyes focused on the judge. The judge cleared her throat. "After careful consideration of all the evidence presented, it is clear that Officer Mallory acted inappropriately and with excessive force. Furthermore, it is apparent that systemic biases played a role in the handling of this case. Therefore, I find the defendant, Tara Okoye, not guilty." Tara's breath caught in her throat. The room erupted in applause, but Tara couldn't move. She felt as though she were still caught in the tension of the moment, still fighting for every ounce of justice. She had won, but she knew the fight was far from over. As she stood there, overwhelmed by the weight of what had just happened, she felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to find Jamal, standing beside her, a small but genuine smile on his face. "You did it, Tara," he said, his voice filled with awe. "You really did it." Tara's eyes welled with tears as she looked at him. She had done it not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been held down by prejudice, for everyone who had ever felt powerless. The victory was sweet, but it was only the beginning. As Tara walked out of the courtroom, the weight of her victory settled in. She had faced down the system and won. But she knew that the fight for justice wasn't over. It had only just begun. The world needed to see this moment, this triumph, and understand that the fight for equality and fairness would never stop until the very system that had oppressed them was dismantled. Her journey had only just started, but Tara Okoye knew this. The power of one voice, one person, was enough to shatter the chains of prejudice. And as she walked into the future, she was ready for whatever came next. Tara's journey is far from over, and neither is the fight for justice. Stay with us for more stories of courage, resilience, and the fight against prejudice. Subscribe now to follow Tara's journey and to be a part of the movement to dismantle harmful stereotypes.